Well, hey everyone, welcome to my talk. It's a bit weird doing it over video recording, but hey, we'll make it work. My talk is called The Player and the Pentacle, Folkloric Motifs for Narrative Design. So before we get into it, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about who I am. I am based in New Zealand, so there is a chance that a lot of you guys probably have not heard of me before. I'll catch you up to speed now. I am a freelance narrative designer, a game writer, transmedia producer, creative director, and screenwriter. I'm also a PhD researcher at AUT, exploring the connection between folklore and interactive game narrative design. I also pioneered New Zealand's first tertiary paper on narrative design at AUT. And I have worked on IPs such as Path of Exile, Orbis VR, Banners of Ruin, Pathfinder, Heroic, Magic Duel. I've also been a narrative consultant for companies like Augusto, which is an advertising agency here in New Zealand, QED Software, and I helped on notes for the interactive theatre piece Pleasure Dome, and most recently have been working with the New Zealand Film Commission as a narrative design mentor for local developers. So we're just going to jump straight into this because there is a lot of content to cover today. So I have cut the content up into different parts to make it easier. So part one, framing the folkloresque. So seeking the missing daughter of a foul-tempered baron, the witcher, Geralt of Rivia, finds himself trekking through a muddy forested swamp. His search has placed him in hot pursuit of a mysterious triad of entities known as the Crones of Crookback Bog. Now, according to the folk stories of the region, the three crones, also known as the Ladies of the Wood, will fulfill the wishes of local villagers in exchange for their children. And this is what one of the notes, I believe it is, in the game says about this. The gods have abandoned us. The mighty of this earth care not for our fate. Only the ladies of the wood watch over the land. In foul times when plague or famine steals our harvest, we must beg the ladies for help. If they deem fit, they will hear our pleas and knock back fortune's foul blows. This is how one begs for help from the ladies. Find a child, young and innocent, and take it to Crookback Bog. Search out the lady's shrine. This is where the trail of treats begins. Set the child off on the trail, and it shall follow its sweet track and find the good ladies. The child will never want for anything ever again, for the ladies are kind and generous. Standing before the shrine, pronounce your request, and the good ladies will hear, for they see and hear all that takes place in their demesne. If you made the offering as it must be done, your supplication will be heard. So as the player explores the bog, they discover a small orphanage hidden within the marshes. This is where the children are sent on the trail of sweets. This is where the children that are sent on the trail of sweets end up. There they are fattened and made ready to be fed for the ladies. So The Witcher 3, as I'm sure quite a few of you know, is a campy D&D style fantasy RPG, but this quest feels particularly powerful and driven by folk tradition. It makes it a great example of what we call the folkloresque. So let's take a moment and break down the different folkloric motifs within this quest so that we can see it a bit more clearly. So first off, we have a cursed swamp. Now, this is a variation of the cursed or forbidden forest found in stories around the world, but primarily in the cultures of Scandinavia. Number two, we have abandonment in the forest. Another common motif in folklore, seen by the villagers sending their children on the trail of treats into the bog. Now I'm just going to move my face here so I can see the rest of this. There we go. Okay, number three, swamp or water as a path to the magical. So water is actually a regular symbol in folk literature. It typically signifies the passing of the hero from the realm of the living and into the realm of the dead. Number four, we have the three witches, again found in various stories around the world, particularly in Germanic lore this time. The motif of three witch sisters is also found throughout Europe. And we'll just move again. This might be a pain, but we'll see how we go. Okay, number five, trail of treats. Magic sweets are found in fairy tales, They're used to lure children to their doom. In Jewish folklore, we find trails that guide characters in the direction of an other world or the world of the dead. Folk tales in India make reference to paths that characters are forbidden to step outside of, or else they will face certain death. Number 6, children being eaten. Now, children are abducted in Icelandic lore. They're murdered in Irish and Jewish stories. Other stories see children abandoned, stolen by witches, sold or promised to fairies. And then in ancient Greece, we have the Lamia, a witch famous for devouring children. Number 7, the godling Johnny. Now, this is a character that, excuse me, that Geralt of Rivia meets on his journey. The character is an unusual creature. It's likely based on the Slavic creature known as the Bozatko. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The Bozatko, which was a benevolent household spirit, similar to like a pixie or a gnome. Number 8, sacrifice for the good of a community. So a reoccurring belief throughout agrarian or farming cultures is that of having to sacrifice something for the good of the community, typically for the good of the harvest. The medieval Benandanti cult of northern Italy, for example, gave their lives to do battle in the spirit against evil witches for the safety of their harvests. So you'll notice that the beats in this Witcher questline are not exact replicas of the motifs I've just described. Rather, they are inspired by or share similarities with these motifs. So I'm going to read you a little quote here from, I believe his name is Michael Dillon Foster. Professor Michael Dillon Foster, and he is one of the eminent researchers on the folkloresque as a methodology. So he says, simply put, the folkloresque is popular culture's own emic perception and performance of folklore. That is, it refers to creative, often commercial products or texts, for example, films, graphic novels, video games, that give the impression to the consumer, viewer, reader, listener, player, that they derive directly from existing folkloric traditions. In fact, however, a folkloresque product is rarely based on any single vernacular item or tradition. Usually it has been consciously cobbled together from a range of folkloric elements, often mixed with newly created elements, to appear as if it emerged organically from a specific source. So using the folkloresque as a methodology imbues your story with a sense of authenticity. It allows audiences to interpret the work as being derived from something larger and steeped in history. And this strengthens your IP, making it durable and long-lasting. Again, from Professor Michael Dillon Foster, the folkloresque is a meaningful form of popular culture because popular culture dreams of being folklore. So quickly, I just want to touch on keys to safe adaptation, because we are talking about traditional cultural stories in many cases, and that immediately brings up the question around cultural appropriation. How do you explore these worlds, these stories, without doing disrespect or appropriating the stories away from the culture that they came from? Excuse me. So when dealing with folklore and traditional stories or other narrative aspects of cultures other than your own, the folkloresque does go a long way to avoiding cultural appropriation, because it is inspired by rather than just flat out copying these motifs. But that being said, there are further keys to safe adaptation that you can hit. For example, always consult or work with someone who belongs to the culture you're interested in exploring. They have information you need. They have information you want. They have information you didn't know you needed or wanted. So allow them to tell their story in collaboration with you. Listen to them. They are the experts. Secondly, be respectful to the source material. Use it as inspiration to create something new, but if you're more interested in something closer to a straight up adaptation of the material, then you need to be certain that you are treating the stories with dignity and accuracy. And this leads into the third key, which is to go straight to the source. Draw your inspiration directly from the people and cultural documents that are inspiring your game world, rather than from other adaptive texts, which may or may not have done a good job in this regard. Your job is to be a professional researcher. Follow academic conventions. And so that's the end of part one. So what I did there was just gave us an understanding of the methodology or the framework through which we're exploring the rest of this talk. So part two is the esoteric origins of narrative design. So here I'm going to establish a historical precedence for using folklore in narrative design. So during legend performance, the boundary of narrator and audience blurs, transmission taking place interactively. The conversational nature of legend, in turn, adds to the believability of the narrative and its function as a mechanism for reaffirming beliefs, since the narrative is not set off by any distancing formula. And so that is by Timothy Tangolini, and he is a folklorist from the 90s. I'm not sure if he's around still, but this is an interesting quote because it tells us a few things. It tells us that legends, and we're using this term loosely here, what we're really talking about is the canon of folklore in general. But legends or folklore are a performance. The storyteller actively provokes the listener into interacting and engaging with the tale on an emotional level. They have a conversational nature. This implies a performative improvisation on behalf of the storyteller. They're essentially making a deal with the audience. And that deal is something along the lines of engage with my story actively, and in return, I will allow you agency in how it plays out. They're not set off by any distancing formula. There is a quality to the telling that lends itself to interactivity and co-creation with the audience. So divination engines are artifacts which have traditionally been used by people to foretell the future. Tarot cards, knuckle bones, runestones, the I Ching, these are just a few examples. They're also known as oracle texts, and these artifacts are the ancestors of our interactive narratives today. Sounds crazy, I know, but they both rely on human input to work and subjective interpretation to tell a story. Divination engines are essentially random storytelling generators. So let's look at tarot cards quickly as an example. They can be seen as a kind of low-tech cyber simulation that users construct stories, their own narratives of destiny from the cards, even when the softwares that they plug into the hardware of the deck are not overtly literary. Readers thus shift from being consumers of text to producers, in a move that corresponds to literary and hypermedia idealizations of literature and literary machines, proposed by many contemporary theoreticians. The resulting transmedia storytelling is a user-mediated play of signifiers and signifieds across modes that extend both our understanding of what literature can be and the many uses of the game of tarot. So that quote is by Dr. Paul Mountford, who happens to be my PhD supervisor. So shout out to Paul. That was his excellent essay, Tarot Guidebooks as a Literary Genre. So here Mountford suggests that by randomly drawing a spread of cards in an attempt to tell the future, players are drawing from their own psyche to construct a simulated narrative from which they can derive meaning. And we'll just move me again. Okay, so tarot begins as a completely non-mystical deck of Italian playing cards known as trionfi, and were used to play tarocchini, a popular game during the mid-15th century across Europe. The cards did not see use as a means of divination until the late 18th century, where their arcane imagery was used as a way through which to interpret future events. These illustrations were suggested by the psychiatrist Carl Jung to be psychological images and symbols that connect us to our unconscious selves. The cards combine in certain ways, and the different combinations correspond to the playful development of mankind. They are sort of archetypal ideas of a differentiated nature. So this is put to brilliant use in Italo Calvini's 1973 ergodic classic, The Castle of Crossed Destinies. Struck mute by a magical forest, several characters take refuge in a castle where they tell each other their stories through drawing cards from different tarot decks. Using the archetypes and symbols in these decks, their tales unfold via the interpretation of the cards. So while divination engines may have fallen out of popularity for most of us, Their influence can still be felt in the interactive random storytelling engines of today. Digital and analog games that make use of narrative to contextualize the way in which the user interacts with or plays with the hardware. So exploring this unusual literary genre establishes a historical and narratological precedent for the use of folklore in narrative design, which I believe we are about to start on now. Part 3, Circles and Stars, introducing my model, the Pentacle model, or the player in the Pentacle. So one of the most recognizable folkloric motifs today is that of the magic circle and the pentacle. Sometimes it's the pentagram drawn within the circle. It's thought to originate from, again, hopefully I don't butcher the pronunciation here, but it originate with the zazuri, an ancient Mesopotamian ritual in which a circle is drawn from flour around a space to purify or protect it from evil influence. So the magic circle has appeared over and over again in different belief systems all the way up to present day, with modern occult religions such as Wicca, as well as obviously appearing in entertainment, film, TV, games, take your pick, you'll find it there. So the magic circle maintains a basic function, which is to govern the boundary between the natural and the supernatural, be it in terms of acting as a protective barrier or in terms of evoking the supernatural from the safety inside the circle. And that is by Eugene Thacker in The Dust of This Planet, Horror of Philosophy, Volume 1. So magic circles have long been incorporated into the lexicon of game design and virtual worlds. In 1938, a book by the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, magic circles are explored. And he says all play moves and has its being within a playground marked off beforehand either materially or ideally deliberately or as a matter of course. Just as there is no formal difference between play and ritual, so the consecrated spot cannot be formally distinguished from the playground. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc. They are all in form and function playgrounds, forbidden spots, isolated, hedged around, hallowed, within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. So to sum up, magic circles consecrate a space. Magic circles govern the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural. Magic circles create temporary worlds within the ordinary worlds, and magic circles can summon spirits or protect the practitioner against them. So the Pentacle of narrative design is a non-linear narrative structure for video games. While a traditional narrative structure follows a linear ascent pathway of, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement or epilogue, the Pentacle considers the direction of story as being unpredictable, instead seeing the experience blossom outwards in multiple directions. The Pentacle also follows the rules we just established around the magic circle. It consecrates or sets apart a space for the player to engage with something beyond themselves. It governs the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. It allows for the fantastical to supersede the normal via ludonarrative immersion. It creates a temporary world within our ordinary world. And lastly, it summons spirits, right? NPCs, enemies, bosses, etc. for the player to engage with. So we're going to go through each point of the star and circle now. So first, you'll see in this little diagram here, the space between the circle and the star has been highlighted as story. So story is the consecrated space within the magic circle. In this context, it is defined as the game world itself. Everything that expresses the creative intentions of the developers to the players. Story includes characters, enemies, items, plot events, etc. But it can also include gameplay, level design, character design, sound effects, VFX, etc. Story is a consecrated and sacred space for the player, meaning that we as developers have a responsibility to protect the player from anything that might pull them out of the game or otherwise be harmful to their experience. Now, this includes ludonarrative dissonance. I'm sure you've all heard that term before, but it is a story that contradicts gameplay or vice versa. And secondly, and I know that I will probably upset some people with this, predatory monetization elements, loot boxes, pay to play, gambling mechanics, all that stuff. These practices, and hear me here, they are unethical. They have a well-documented history of negatively affecting neurodiverse players or those with pre-existing addiction issues. These sorts of things will only hurt your game in the long run. They may seem like a good idea, but they really aren't. Instead, try focusing on delivering a product that players can emotionally resonate with. This will create for you an IP that is evergreen and fans that will stick with you for life. So let's just move on next to, onto the head of the pentacle. So this is the top point of the star, and this is lore. Now, lore is a focused approach to crafting the richness and nuance found in great story worlds like Lord of the Rings, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Skyrim, Bloodborne, Game of Thrones, take your pick, right? Now, it is compiled along with other world building elements in a story Bible. Lore is made up of generalized world building. That can be things like geography, language, culture, history, religion, biology, horticulture, so on and so forth. Everything your game needs to exist as a believable world where actual people reside. Lore often contains content that your player may never see. However, its inclusion serves as important creative text for others in the development pipeline, and it can also be used to extend your world via DLCs and sequels, as well as transmedia offshoots. Now, these are things like graphic novels, web series, movies, etc. Moving on to part three, to the left arm of the pentacle. Now, this is deep lore. Now, I named it deep lore because of the depth it brings to a player's understanding of a game world. It's defined, in my mind, as collecting all the world building elements that are crucial to understanding the plot and ultimately the message of your game's story. It is a world building discipline that focuses on crucial elements like character backstories, the cosmological rules of the game, structural politics of the world, etc. These are elements that, while are not immediately affecting the flow of the plot, work to contextualize plot events or foreshadow things yet to come. So to give you an example, knowing how to speak Quenya, the Elvish language from Lord of the Rings, is a great example of lore. It strengthens the believability of the world that there are these different languages at play, but it has no effect on understanding the basic plot of Lord of the Rings. On the flip side, the tragic backstory of Gollum is a good example of deep lore. It highlights Gollum's motivations as a character and gives us understanding around the conclusion of his storyline and the plot in general. So deep lore is exposition, yes, but it is a special kind of exposition. It is exposition that players need to encounter on their own terms, as if they are discovering it rather than having it drip fed to them. So the right arm of the pentacle is narrative. Now, narrative concerns itself solely with the mode of telling being used in the game world to convey lore, deep lore, and plot to the player. When we discuss or consider narrative, we're looking at what tools we want to use to present information to the player. So narrative relates directly to the working parts of the game's story: NPCs, items, enemies, text-based pickups, audio diaries, music, visual style, tone, level design, etc. Ask yourself, how do all these disparate elements come together to tell a cohesive story? How do they guide the player through the deeper themes or philosophical questions we are asking through our game world? The left foot of the pentacle is plot, and plot functions similarly in an interactive piece to how it does in a traditional story, with one key amendment. Plot is specifically focused on the actions that the player can take to influence the sequence of events leading to certain outcomes in the story. With this in mind, more traditional elements of plot can be considered as well, such as looking at your game through the lens of an action line, the physical journey of the player, or a relational line, the emotional journey between the player, their avatar, and the most important NPC or NPCs in the game to the player and the avatar. So not all games require both an action line and a relational line, but it does pay to consider both during the development process. As I'm sure you can imagine, a game like Doom does really well with an action line, but may not have a relational line, or at least not a very strong relational line. But I would suggest considering both just in general to make sure you've got all your bases covered. So the right foot of the pentacle is of course play, which is perhaps the most important element to consider for your game's story. Like plot, play explores the actions taken by the player as they interact with the world. The main difference here is that play focuses on allying itself with all the other elements of the pentacle, so story, lore, deep lore, narrative, and plot. It requires the narrative designer to come alongside and engage with others in the development pipeline, particularly those working on gameplay mechanics, to make sure that the story and its themes are accurately reflected in every Ludo element of the game. For example, let's look at the new Wolfenstein games, right? They're games where the story is thematically about the horrors of war. So the gameplay should reflect that by cultivating a sense of horror in the player when they are forced to take a life. Of course, as much as I love the Wolfenstein games, and I do love them because I love killing Nazis, but as much as I love it, they reward you for killing Nazis, and the more crazy to kill, the better. And so that is in direct opposition to the narrative themes of the game. And so that is the pentacle part of my narrative model. So we're going to just move on straight into part 4 now. So this is Unio Mystica, which means mystical union in Latin. And this is a new way of thinking about character. So in the pagan traditions that are found across Europe, we see a recurring belief that the human soul is comprised of multiple elements collectively referred to as the double or the alter ego. Now, these elements are usually broken down into, and this is the Germanic version here, the Fylgja, which is a female spirit that follows, protects, and guides a bloodline, the Hammer, a physical double of a person capable of traveling great distances instantly, and this is both on Earth and into the other world of the afterlife. They're also able to interact physically with the world around them. And then lastly, the Huga, and this is a kind of formless energy that animates both the person it belongs to and the Hammer when it needs to leave the person's body to travel. So the double forms the basis for the second half of the player and pentacle model, which explores how we can create unio mystica, or mystical union, between the player and their character. Each element of the double directs this intimacy during the writing process. Included also are 3 more common folkloric elements connected to the double, and these are the soul of bones. Now this is the belief that the eternal part of a being resided within the marrow of one's bones. The shadow, a visible form of a person's soul, which went on in literary traditions to be representative of the darker part of their psyche, something to be overcome. I'm sure you've all heard of the shadow before. And lastly, the doppelganger. Now this is a perfect physical lookalike of a person, usually seen as a bad omen or an evil twin, but this tradition, like the shadow, has also found a home in literary theory in the form of what we call the inverted foil, a character that is the inversion rather than the opposite of the protagonist, who forces them into confrontation with their shadow. So video games, as I'm sure we're all aware, are a unique medium that places the player directly within the body of a character rather than having them observe one like in film and TV. So unlike other mediums, we're not trying to get the player to empathize with the protagonist. Rather, we are asking the player to embody the protagonist, to wear them like a glove, to be closer to them than their own skin. In the player and the Pentacle model, the player is intimately aware of the protagonist's emotional life. The player is in union with them. Union begins with the understanding that the player is our Hugo. They are the energy or essence that animates both the protagonist and their Harma. The Hugo is suggestive of a player's ability to involve themselves with and control multiple aspects of the story world. So the content we pass out to the player is able to be explored, played with, reshaped, and sent back to us, as well as out to other players. This mirrors the highly interactive exchange between shamanistic storytellers and their audiences of our ancient past, right? Now, traditionally, the Hugo is disembodied, but it's also what gives the body life. It can influence others over great distances and superposition itself across other dimensions. So the Hugo, or player's first point of call when entering the game, is to enter or create a protagonist to role players. Understanding the difference between the player and the character they inhabit is key here, as it allows us to consider the player and the protagonist in cohabitation with each other rather than the player possessing them. So cohabitation means that the will of an authored character is not superseded entirely by the will of the player. Respecting this separation encourages the player to work alongside the protagonist to achieve their aim. The player's actions then become colored by the personality of the character they are occupying. Through all this, we can see that the protagonist is a kind of collection of traits that need to be fed or reinforced by the player, resulting in a desire to positively engage with the narrative themes instead of fighting against them. Okay, so the player is the Harma. The Hugo has the ability to sheath itself within the Harma, a physical double of a person, so as to complete tasks far away, or in some cases, other worlds entirely. Excuse me. Likewise, the player, or the Hugo, has the ability to leave the game world and superposition themselves through the Harma, or their real selves, into our post-digital world, which is our other world of pervasive communication. So we can consider the Harma as being an avatar constructed by the player to best reach those that exist on transmediated platforms outside the game. So things like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, blogs, fan fiction. Through technology, players have the power to nourish and grow stories they like, or cut back and destroy those that they don't. So compare this for a moment to the audiences of folklore in the past, choosing to share and edit their own folk stories, or to let them fall into insignificance. A player can now push their likes, dislikes, thoughts, suggestions, and demands across multiple platforms at once to potentially thousands of people at the same time. Stories that begin as small anecdotes or discussions online now have the power to balloon at a rapid speed and change the world around them. The author or authors or the developers are no longer in control of the narrative. Instead, we are in conversation with the player. The player in the Pentacle model seeks to embrace this reversal of power through the act of regenerative listening and understand the player's ability to influence our story and use it to affect our reality. So the player's ability to occupy their Harma and project themselves across social media opens up new avenues for narrative design, obviously, around the onboarding and offboarding of a game. Also, when the player tweets a review or pauses the game to take a break, the story no longer ends. Instead, it's an opportunity to explore new avenues of immersion. Knowing your players are eager and willing to get in that wet sand with us and start shaping castles means we can deliberately leave parts of the game world vague so that they can create answers for themselves. So moving on, let's look at the protagonist and their shadow. So the shadow is the true threat to success in a player and Pentacle narrative. It represents the untamed, violent nature of the protagonist and is what threatens to consume them if they do not overcome it. The shadow is a complex psychological product of living within a broken system. Your protagonist will have developed their shadow as a side effect of existing within a system founded on tribalism and violence. And while the protagonist and the player might be pitted against an evil villain, the true threat to their survival is internal. The shadow's aim is to convince the protagonist to selfishly attend their own desires at the cost of the needs of others. It demands that they assert their rightness over another's and stomp out any worldviews in contradiction to their own. So the shadow demands a world of black and white instead of one of diversity. Its agenda is based out of a poverty mindset. It fears those outside of itself because their views might mean that the views of the shadow are wrong. So when a primitive civilization grows beyond scattered isolation, it inevitably comes into conflict with itself. The same is true with the mimetic spread of narrative. While the truth remains that we're all one people and that we're stronger together than apart, our interpretations of that truth can differ wildly, resulting in conflict between those who should be working together to face the ultimate threats of our age, things like hatred, greed, sickness, fascism, environmental collapse, and so on, unfortunately. So moving on, let's look at the doppelganger. So existing in the game world, there should be another character or process that inverts the traits of the protagonist and forces them to confront the dark side of who they are, their shadow. The protagonist must overcome and defeat their shadow or be completely consumed by it before the story is truly over. So the Folklore as an anti-shadow in the Soul of Bones. In the Folklore, we see a tutelary genie, a being of light, a representation of the feminine, of destiny, of protection, mentorship, and love. In a player and Pentacle narrative, we view the Folklore as an opposite to the shadow, and the Soul of Bones is the thing which keeps us motivated to persist within the game world. There can and will be overlap between these two elements. So the Folklore always points to an identity that the protagonist can become, or at least aspire towards, if they overcome their shadow. It is the Folklore's job to act as a distant call to the protagonist, reminding them of their true self and encouraging them to pass through the dominion of the shadow so as to join her and grow as a character. The Soul of Bones, on the other hand, represents how the mortality of the protagonist anchors them to their quest. What is stopping them from tapping out, giving up, falling off the map? The Soul of Bones is a recurring element in your story that forces the protagonist and the player to keep moving forward. So the Folklore exists primarily for a narrative purpose, whereas the Soul of Bones is represented mainly through gameplay. Sometimes these two components will exist as the same thing, other times they might be entirely separate. So the Folklore could be a character or characters, an event or events within the plot that repeatedly drive home the narrative moral or theme of the story. For example, strength is found in empathy and compassion rather than endless cycles of violence. The Soul of Bones, however, might relate to something more practical, such as saving a loved one or hunting down a powerful relic. It just needs to be explored via narratively driven gameplay. Okay, so let's bring it all together now. So first, the player, acting as a kind of hygge, steps into cohabitation with the protagonist by entering a magic circle and engaging with the story world. They center themselves within the 5-pointed pentacle of narrative design. Now separate from the real world, they are consecrated and set apart. Within this circle, the player is free to engage with the story in a nonlinear way, exploring lore, deep lore, or plot in whichever order they like through the process of play. As the protagonist, they cross paths with their doppelganger or inverted foil who pushes them to confront the shadow that haunts their story. The Folklore, an anti-shadow and representation of who they might become, calls out across the world as an echo, drawing them forward through conflicts external and internal. So it is through following the Folklore that they are taught the importance of collective movement and the sacrifice of self. They overthrow the shadow, which is itself a representation of individualism, thus reaching transformation. Meanwhile, through a process of empathetic design, the story world actively accounts for the player's ability to sheath themselves within the hammer, an avatar or narrative process based outside the circle of play. the other world of nonlinear digital communication. This allows for regenerative listening on behalf of the developers and for co-authorship of the story IP. And that is it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm gutted that I couldn't actually be there for this, but we got through it in the end. So feel free, if you want my slides, to hit me up online. My Twitter handle is @thepunkwriter, P-U-N-K. So just hit me up there. I will give you the notes, and I can answer any questions that you might have. Anyway, thank you so much for that, guys. Enjoy the rest of the conference.